Well, welcome to our December Planet Possible MiniPod. I'm Niki Roach, and this is a monthly update where we react to current events in water, climate and nature. And it's a mini-pod because it'll only take about 15 minutes of your time, and it means you get a Planet Possible episode every 2 weeks. Each mini-pod, I'm joined by an environmental expert, and we explore 3 issues that are making the headlines, keeping you up to date with what's happening around the world and where my guest sees exciting possibilities. So this mini-pod, my guest is a director in water at Arup, Will McBain, and we'll be talking about the government review of partnership funding for flood and coastal erosion risk management, new figures that reveal 86% of rivers tested in England and Wales were found to have bee-killing neonicotinoid pesticides present, and Will's passion for a multi-generational programme of nature connection. So welcome to the mini-pod, Will.
Thanks, Niki.
Let's get started. So the first thing you want to talk about, Will, is this government review of partnership funding for flood and coastal erosion risk management. Tell me what caught your eye and why that's a news item this week.
Well, it's always exciting when a new government gets into power to see what they're planning. And I was delighted to hear last week that there is a plan to review the funding regime for what I primarily do at the moment, which is flood resilience and climate change adaptation. And the partnership funding regime that's in place has been in place since 2011. So it's been around a long time. It's been tweaked over the years, but I think there's a feeling that there's now a need to shift ourselves into a slightly different approach to how we fund flood resilience measures across the nation.
Just give listeners a sense of what partnership funding for flood and coastal erosion risk management actually is.
So partnership funding was implemented in 2011, and it's basically quite an enlightened regime that acknowledged that central government funding for flood defence projects was a good thing, but ultimately it meant that local communities could rely on central funding rather than engaging and putting their own money into and helping to shape projects locally. And the idea of partnership funding is that no scheme would necessarily get 100% funding from central government. It would encourage local authorities, developers, others to crowd in and bring in additional top-up monies, which would in turn give them the opportunity to shape the schemes that were implemented on the ground. So a very positive thing, and it has succeeded in bringing additional money into the programme that wouldn't have otherwise been secured.
So what are you expecting from the review, Will?
There's a well-developed critique. And first of all, if you implement a new regime for which schemes are going to be attractive based on this approach, then those schemes jump to the top of the list. And we've been slowly working our way down that list over the last 12, 13 years, such we're now getting to a point where the schemes at the end of that list are the really challenging ones. Schemes where there's a big flooding problem there's a need, but actually solving that problem is really, really challenging. Or certainly it's challenging to get it through the hoops that you have to jump through in order to attract that grant and aid funding.
Any thoughts on what you think it might look like?
There is a feeling that we need to be more joined up in terms of, everyone talks about integrated catchment management and nature-based solutions. And I think it will definitely aim, to take a more holistic catchment-based approach to how we approach solving problems in place. There have already been attempts to try and make it easier for local authorities to attract funding to address flash flooding and surface water problems. The thing about flash flooding is that quite often it's not as deep, not as widespread, but it happens incredibly quickly, and it can be really dirty, and it can take people by surprise, and it can be a real hazard. So I think there will be an attempt to try and make those types of scheme a bit more easy to attract funding for, and I think there'll be a push towards using blue-green infrastructure and nature-based solutions to address those problems, because that's such an attractive option to improve cities and towns and places by implementing green space to make space for water in cities. So I anticipate a shift in that direction. But the big one, I think, is probably away from building shiny new projects towards really nurturing and looking after our existing asset base, because we've got billions of pounds worth and thousands of kilometres of flood defence assets in place, and we need to make sure that they're reliable. But more than that, we need to think about how they perform when we get these, what we call design exceedance events. So when they're overtopped, actually designers designing them when they were designed 30 years ago might have designed them such that, well, it overtops, it's failed effectively. Well, it hasn't failed, it's overtopped. And what you need to make sure, or increasingly we need to make sure, is that they don't fail, they don't breach. The water goes over the top. There's less water going over the top, and they provide some benefit. There'll be less water travelling into the town or the city than would have been if the walls weren't there or the banks weren't there. But they don't breach, they remain there, the water drains away, and they're there for ready for the next flood. Finally, it's the resilience piece. Partnership funding is very much based on the concept of shifting properties from one risk band to another risk band. It's very difficult to do that without building physical infrastructure that says, right, you flood, and then we put a wall there and you don't flood. Well, that's stopping them from flooding, but it's not necessarily making communities more resilient if you define resilience as their ability to understand their risk, to respond, adapt, and be prepared so that when flooding happens, that they know what to do, they know the drill, and they can get back to normal as quickly as possible. And that's a huge theme already to the Environment Agency's national strategy, a nation ready and resilient to the impacts of climate change.
Okay, so let's move on to our second topic. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about bees and sugar beet and a group of pesticides called neonicotinoids, or neonics, which is much easier for me to say. So this was something that I heard Richard Benwell, who leads the Wildlife and Countryside Link, talk about earlier on this week. For those that don't know, because I didn't at the time, neonics are used to protect crops like sugar beet and oilseed rape from pests and viruses. It's also a group of pesticides that are used to control fleas and lice in livestock and dogs, which is interesting. 2 years ago, the UK government issued an emergency authorisation for the use of them. But there are really significant environmental concerns because even at low doses, neonics can impact pollinators. So bees in particular, their ability to navigate can change. But what I found flabbergasting was that a single teaspoon of neonicotinoid can kill over 1.25 billion honeybees. So it just gave me a real sense of the scale of the issue. And the reason it's in the news is because two reasons, actually. One is that the Environment Agency data that's just come out shows that in 86% of rivers in England and Wales, they were found. And then in addition to that, the Office of Environmental Protection has just given an information notice to Defra setting out details of potential failures around the authorisation, these emergency authorisations of neonics. So middle to the end of January, Defra have got to respond to the OEP about whether they should have done these emergency authorisations. And at the same time, we're seeing those pesticides appearing in lots of our rivers. So interested to hear any thoughts you've got on neonics and on pesticides more generally, really, I suppose, Will.
Well, I was of that generation. I graduated in 1992 from Edinburgh University, the year of the Rio Earth Summit. But I'd grown up on a diet of reading people like Rachel Carson. And, you know, we think that Rachel Carson is a historical figure and that the silent spring that she talked about, where all the birds would be dead because all the insects had been destroyed, was something that happened in the past and we moved on from that. Well, we have, you know, we were using DDT in the 60s. We were using extremely toxic chemicals. So there have been improvements. But what's happened over the last 30, 40 years is a burgeoning of chemicals. We have tens of thousands of new chemicals coming out into the market all the time. And I think chemicals regulation has fallen behind. We've got to be realistic about the fact that it has fallen behind. The Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution did a report, I think in the early noughties, looking at this issue, chemicals in products. They were saying how, you know, we need to be much better at looking at synergistic effects, so where you have combinations of chemicals and antagonistic effects. And, you know, this chemical cocktail, they're doing a study at the moment of all the Dales rivers. And you'd think that you were in Upper Wharfdale, you know, you'd be pretty chemical free. But there's caffeine in just about every river in the Yorkshire Dales. Caffeine's quite a strong drug. You know, and you think what an impact it has on a diatom, a microorganism. We've got these pathways. So rain falls on the landscape and we have a drained landscape and we have these pathways from the land to the rivers and to the sea. And if you look at, you know, Johan Rockstrom talking about the 9 planetary boundaries, you know, nutrient enrichment of the oceans is one of those. To me, we've got to be thinking about, you know, the polluter pays principle, obviously, but also source control. And that's not necessarily just thinking about controlling it and making sure that chemicals and agrochemicals and fertiliser lands on the ground and is used in place to promote growth and control weeds and pests. It's also thinking about which chemicals we use. You need to be sort of using ones that are just good enough to do the job without wiping out huge numbers of insects. And the dog one is a classic. I mean, we found that out, that those things that you put on the back of a dog's net are sort of 1 million times more toxic than what used to be used to control ticks and lice. And if you put them on the back of your dog's neck and then it goes swimming in a river, there's no doubt that that will have an impact on the river environment. And there's no need to use those products. And I think vets need to be alive to that.
Right, final topic. And so this is where you get to talk about what's possible and bring a bit of your passion to the pod, which I'm looking forward to hearing. So you wanted to talk about our connection with nature. So tell me a little bit more about why this is something you're so passionate about, Will.
Well, I'm a country boy, Niki, so I was very lucky and fortunate to grow up in the country, but I know there are an awful lot of people who don't have that opportunity. And my wife, Ruth, works for the National Park. She takes kids out into the National Park, and she's a trained forest schools practitioner. The wisdom there behind forest schools and outdoor learning is around going out into nature is important, but it's the nature connection that is really important. Actively engaging with the natural world. If you take children pre the age of 11 and get them out into nature and actively engaging with it, it can have a fairly transformative impact. But we're not great in this nation. I mean, I've just heard that Ingleborough Hall, which is Bradford's sort of outdoor learning centre, is closing. And a centre that I went to at Malham Tarn, the Field Studies Centre there, had a real important impact on me. I spent a week there learning about the evolution of the bog in Malham Tarn and looking at rivers. And that is sadly closing. And it seems that these foundational issues we have around nature connectedness and understanding that passion for the natural world, that sort of sense of awe that you can be instilled in people, to instill those sort of pro-environmental behaviours, they're somewhat being neglected because of the very present issues that we need to tackle related to the consequences of that loss of nature connection. You know, the physical ill health, the mental ill health, the social care costs, that are very pressing and immediate needs. But I think my magic wand, I think you were going to ask me if I had a magic wand, what I'd do with it, I think would be to implement a fairly comprehensive national programme to encourage nature connectedness. So that might include, I think the Outdoor Learning Institute has been asking for a nature premium for primary schools, and that would pay for all schools to ensure that all primary school children had a programme to get out and do outdoor learning and connect with nature. But you'd extend it beyond that, and I think my magic wand would make it almost mandatory for young people to spend some time out in the natural world. Ideally, my plan would be to engage in nature recovery, because everyone's talking a lot about planting trees in the right places, obviously, but there are huge areas that do need attention. We can't just leave them to it entirely. And that requires a lot of work. So there's a real opportunity there. So you could have that nature connection. And then finally would be around access to land. So a plot of land. We've got a great system of allotments in this country, but they're huge waiting lists. And actually, if you thought quite creatively about that, I know there are in Bristol and now in Leeds, there's a social enterprise, might even be a commercial enterprise, that is renting land off farmers and then dividing into plots and renting out allotments. And it's proving very popular. But actually, if you could go beyond that, give everyone who wants it and perhaps push them in that direction a bit more, might want it a bit more if they've done the Nature Connection programme early on, to have access to grow their own food. And the final thing would be around this shift to how we produce our food. And I remember a friend of mine said, well, we should all shift to permaculture. And I kind of laughed at him. I thought, permaculture? There's no way we can produce the nation's food needs on a permacultural basis. But actually, the more I think about it, the more I think that we could use the land we have to become highly productive of agricultural produce in a way that doesn't damage the soils, doesn't take the carbon out, and in fact puts the carbon back in, and generates healthy food. There are ways of producing our protein needs that would be the product of innovation in that space. But I do think that connection to the land is really important.
That is, unfortunately, all we've got time for. These mini pods are quick. Hopefully it's given you something to think about. I'm really pleased that you've joined us. Will, it's been wonderful to have you with us as well. You can subscribe to Planet Possible on your usual podcast player to never miss an episode. We always love to hear your ratings and reviews. We've got more fantastic guests and episodes lined up for the rest of this year, what's left of it, and into 2025 as well. And we're talking about the flooding in Valencia that Will mentioned in our next episode, so tune in for that. All that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to my wonderful guest, Will McBain. Thanks, Will.
Thank you very much, Niki.
That's it, everyone. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll see you next time.